Okay, great. So hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. I am going to be talking, so first of all, my name is Adi Wiezel. I am a I am a fifth year PhD student in social psychology at Arizona State University. And I'm going to be presenting some work that I'm doing with my collaborators at Arizona State University on revisiting the alpha male stereotype in leadership. So this talk is going to address stereotypes and preferences related to sex, prestige, and dominance. But first, let's begin with the famous account from primatologist Frans de Waal. So imagine that you're standing among a troop of chimpanzees, and this particular individual stands up straight and has his hair on end and is holding a rock. And others pant, grunt, and scamper away, mostly on all fours. This is the alpha male. But our opening example is not unique to chimps. It's in other primates as well, such as gorillas, baboons, and also wolves, and perhaps humans. So many people tend to think of human leaders as men. So organizational behavior researcher Virginia Shine looked at 30 years of data from across a variety of continents to establish that there was a think manager, think male effect. Similarly, many people think of human leaders as dominant. One such example is Newt Gingrich, the Republican former Speaker of the House, who used to actually recommend to incoming senators that they read Frans de Waal's book, Chimpanzee Politics. And the reason for this had to do with the fact that he viewed that politics was largely characterized by these aggressive status competitions in the kind of chimpanzee-like sense. However, when we consider comparisons between humans and other species, we must think about similarities as well as differences. So Newt Gingrich recognized the similarities. Like other species, humans have a pathway to status and leadership known as dominance. So like the other chimps that maybe pant grunt to steer clear of the alpha, dominance is a strategy wherein others want to largely avoid the dominant individual because that individual is trying to acquire status and leadership as characterized by using force or threat. But once humans started living in groups that share information with one another, we got another pathway to status and leadership, and that is prestige. And unlike dominance, people actually want to be near prestigious individuals because that status is voluntarily given to the prestigious individuals because they have unique, valuable knowledge and skills. And this was a distinction that was largely made by Henrik and Gil White in the early 2000s. So we know how Newt Gingrich feels, but we wanted to know how this stereotype plays out in people nowadays. We know that there are more women visibly in elected offices and in businesses. So do people continue to imagine alpha male leaders? And is that who they prefer? Do they actually want to work for alpha male leaders? So our questions largely hedge on the idea of the relationship between sex, prestige, and dominance as it relates to both stereotypes and to preferences. Importantly, this relationship between stereotypes and preferences matters because it has a very real world implication. So for instance, women are underrepresented in a variety of domains, such as business and politics. And one of the reasons it's argued that this happens is because there is a persistent male stereotype. So this idea that men are more consistently associated with being in management or in politics tends to make women the less likely prototype. But also the implicit assumption is they might not be the preferred leaders either. So we wanted to look at these relationships between stereotypes and preferences across a variety of different studies. And I'm going to kind of foreshadow results a little bit, but using a bunch of different methods, what we're seeing is that people do tend to imagine leaders as males and to some extent as dominant, but they don't necessarily prefer this dominance or this maleness. Moreover, this effect seems to hold even when we add important controls, so things like qualifications of the leaders, and also across different domains of leadership. But let's dig into the data. So if you're one of our undergraduate participants, you would see 2 prompts presented in random order, and then we'd ask you a bunch of evaluation questions. You might be asked to imagine a leader who has a lot of power and has authority and control over people. People don't get in this person's way. This is our way of getting at the idea of dominance. And in a random order, you'd also be presented with imagine a leader who has a lot of prestige and has people's respect and admiration. people seek this person out. So these would be presented in a random order. And one of the questions that we asked was, what was the sex of this person that you imagined? So let's start with the dominant leader. So what we found is that 86% of our participants who were first presented with the dominant vignette imagined a male. Similarly, 75% of our participants that were presented with the prestigious candidate first or individual first imagined a male. So what we're seeing is in both of these conditions, in both the dominant and the prestigious condition, people are stereotyping these leaders as being male. But this is about stereotypes. Now we're kind of curious, how does this relate to people's preferences? So what we had participants do is that they would imagine the same two prompts with the opposite sex. So if our participant imagined a male for a dominant leader initially, they would also be asked the same vignette, and then they would be asked to imagine that person as a female leader. So this meant that our participants saw 4 conditions within subjects. They imagined a dominant male, a dominant female, a prestigious male, and a prestigious female leader. And we were then asking them how much they would want to work for each of the leaders they imagined. So let's take each in turn. For dominant leaders, what we saw is that looking at that red bar, people actually preferred working for the female leader that they imagined. Similarly, when we looked at prestigious leaders, our participants also preferred working for they preferred working for a female leader. However, dwarfing this effect, we saw a preference for prestige. What's notable about these findings is these are the very same participants who initially imagined more males. So even though they were stereotyping the leaders in both of these conditions as males, that wasn't necessarily who they preferred. Rather, they showed a slight preference for females and a considerable preference for prestigious leaders. Now, there's a confound here. If these female and prestigious leaders are, for example, rarer, maybe if they managed to get a leadership position that our participants could imagine, they were incredibly extraordinary. So what we wanted to do is to control for this possibility by running a study that had vignettes where we were able to control the amount of experience that these candidates had. So in this case, we used candidates, and participants were shown with 2 different leadership candidates who were in an organization that the participants were in that was looking for a new leader. And both of these candidates were matched in terms of having a decade of experience. These particular candidates varied in whether they were male or female, and in whether they were described as dominant, that is, knowing how to take command and forceful and assertive, and prestigious, looked up to by their peers or admired and well-respected. So these were between subjects. You'd see male, female, or dominant and prestigious. Now, we wanted to look at how this related to a variety of traits and outcomes. And the first one of interest was the extent to which we had participants want to work for this person. So to orient you to this graph, on the leftmost side, in the gray bars, we have a comparison between a male dominant candidate and a female prestigious candidate. Then on the right side, with the yellow bars, we have a comparison condition between a male prestigious candidate and a female dominant candidate. So if we expected to see a sex effect here, so for example, a female preference, we would have actually expected both of those bars on the right side to be higher, but that's not what we see. What we see here is that in both of these conditions, our participants are preferring the prestigious leader. So why? Why this preference for prestige? Well, one possibility is looking at some of the other traits that we had participants rate. Let's begin with the similarities. Both dominant and prestigious candidates of either sex were seen as equally good at getting the group to accomplish a task. This means that they were seen as equally effective, which is probably a good thing because we described these candidates as equally qualified. However, dominant candidates were thought to be more aggressive and more exploitative than their prestigious counterparts of either sex. And prestigious candidates were seen as kinder and specifically better at getting the group to get along than their dominant candidates of either sex. So notably, this corroborates some of the previous literature that looks at inferences related to dominance and prestige. So prior work has looked at both self-report and peer ratings and finds that dominance tends to be associated more with aggression, whereas prestige tends to be associated more with prosociality. So we're seeing something similar here. Our dominant candidates were seen as more aggressive and exploitative, and our prestigious candidates were seen as better at getting the group to get along and as kinder. So what this suggests is that potentially our participants like some of the traits associated with prestige, such as being able to get the group to get along and being kind, while disliking some of the traits that are associated with dominance, such as aggression and exploitation. Okay, but what we've covered so far is a couple of different disciplines. So in our first study, we had participants spontaneously imagine leaders, and we don't necessarily know what domain that leader was in. So maybe it was Newt Gingrich's home turf, politics. In our second study, we had two candidates jockeying for a position in an organization, which is implicitly the business context. But we might ask whether this holds across different kinds of domains. So in this study, we were interested in examining how this played out across different disciplines. So our participants were asked to imagine effective leaders across a variety of different domains. So if you were a participant, you might have been asked between subjects to imagine a highly effective business leader. Or you might be asked to imagine a highly effective leader in the arts. And then we were interested in asking participants, was this person male or female? How dominant was this person? And how prestigious was this person? So these, again, are questions about stereotypes. Let's begin with sex. And let's start with the first two domains that we've kind of already covered. So in business and politics, our participants were imagining these effective leaders as being male, considerably more often than female. But this didn't seem to just be something that held in these domains, whereas across the board, we're seeing kind of above average in terms of maleness, no significant difference in the arts, but overall in at least the military, sports, business, politics, and science, our participants were imagining men significantly more often than women. How about prestige and dominance? Well, looking again across our 6 different fields of military, sports, business, politics, science, and the arts, what we're seeing here is actually that little dotted line is the midpoint of our scale. So that's the point that reflects about average on prestige. So across all of these different domains, including military and the sports, what we're seeing is that leaders that are effective are imagined as high on prestige. But what's interesting is that unexpectedly, leaders across these domains are also imagined as quite high on dominance. So there are some minor differences among domains, and we'll get back to the idea of dominance momentarily. But the major takeaway here is that these effective leaders across these 6 domains are imagined as high on prestige and on dominance. But again, this relates to stereotypes, and we were curious how these played out in terms of people's preferences. So collapsing across the different domains, we ran a regression predicting the extent to which people would like to work for a leader. And we were interested in including sex, prestige, and dominance as predictors. And what we found was that we expected dominance to be disliked, but it wasn't significant. So that's negative, but there's no star there. That wasn't a significant relationship. What we saw instead is that femaleness and prestige in particular were the aspects that were liked, even among these same participants that are imagining primarily men and primarily dominant and prestigious individuals across these different fields. So this was surprising to us. There were 2 things that were surprising in particular. The first is that across domains, these 6 domains, effective leaders were seen as high on prestige, but also high on dominance. And now dominance wasn't significantly disliked. So this made us wonder if there's something more nuanced going on with dominance. That is, maybe dominance can be broken down to 2 different aspects: the coercive, maybe bad aspects of dominance, and perhaps the more preferred aspects of dominance, the ability to command. So in our next study, rather than having participants rate individuals on the word dominant and prestigious, we had participants rate a number of traits taken from the literature that were related to dominance and prestige. And we had 16 of these that we took from the prior literature. And as an aside, in another undergraduate sample, we had participants rate these 16 different traits, 8 related to prestige, 8 related to dominance, on how bad to negative or good to positive those were. We're going to start with the 8 traits related to prestige first. So here, these included things like high in mastery, competent, expert, and experienced. And again, low numbers indicate bad or negative, higher numbers indicate good or positive. And what we're seeing here is that there's not a lot of range. So people are primarily rating prestige as potentially a positive or good trait. This was not the same case for the 8 traits related to dominance. Here, what we saw is rather a separation between 2 different groups. 4 items that were likely to bully, threatening, controlling, and power hungry, rated as potentially more bad or negative. And 4 other traits, commanding, assertive, powerful, and strong, as rated as somewhat more positive. And just as a note, we've collected some more data here that's not just related to bad or negative and good and positive ratings. And what we found is that although we don't have perfect fit indices or all of the right answers, we do see a separation such that we can measure in factor analyses, we get one kind of composite for prestige and better fit when we divide up between these 2 aspects of dominance than when we treat dominance as one thing. And indeed, in the next study that we're about to present, we saw that these traits hung fairly well together in the form of alphas. So we had these 8 prestige traits. We had 4 of these more lowly rated dominance traits that we called coercive dominance, which included things like likely to bully, threatening. And we also had these 4 more highly rated traits of commanding and assertive, powerful, and strong as commanding dominance. And from a theoretical perspective, this might make sense. Dominance, insofar as it's related to the ability to coerce and, to have physical formidability, it might be a double-edged sword. It might allow you to do different kinds of things. It might allow you to exploit, as in the case of coercive dominance, or confer benefits on your followers, as in the case of commanding dominance. So what we were interested in doing next is our previous studies focused on spontaneously generated leaders and on vignettes. What we were interested in doing now is how about looking at faces? We know that people are good at making various inferences, including related to dominance, on the basis of appearance. And how did these play out in terms of stereotypes and preferences? We were also interested in including our dominance and prestige trait ratings, which are potentially a bit more nuanced. And we wanted to use stimuli that our US MTurkers wouldn't be familiar with. So our honors student, Chris Martos, compiled faces of male and female parliamentarians from Sweden, Norway, Hungary, and Slovakia to get a variety of faces. And participants were not told who the faces were. So here's a sample of some of these faces. And notably, participants varied in the extent to which they rated these individual faces as dominant in the commanding sense, dominant in the coercive sense, and also prestigious. And we were also interested in asking our participants whether they would like to elect this person as a governor of their state. So we're going to start again with the stereotypes as it relates to males and females. And what we found is that first, we saw this effect again where people preferred or were more likely to elect the female faces. Interestingly, we didn't see any distinction between male and female faces in terms of prestige. But now let's get to some of the more interesting nuance as it relates to dominance. When it came to commanding dominance, that is the traits of commanding, assertive, powerful, and strong, there was no sex difference between whether male or female faces were viewed as more commandingly dominant. However, when it came to coercive dominance, which were the aspects of being likely to bully or threatening, controlling, and power hungry, these more less liked potentially aspects of dominance, we saw that male faces were seen as significantly more coercively dominant. But how do these traits relate to the ability to predict voting? So when we use sex, prestige, commanding dominance, and coercive dominance, what do we see? So we ran this very regression, and what we were interested in treating as a dependent variable is the likelihood that people would elect this person as a governor of their state. Now when we incorporate prestige, commanding dominance, and coercive dominance, the sex effect goes away. What we are left with is a strong preference for prestige, a marginal preference for commanding dominance, and a significant dislike for coercive dominance, which is also that type of dominance that men tended to score higher on. So let's return to our research questions. We started off this talk by asking how the alpha male stereotype relates to both stereotypes and also to preferences. That is, do people imagine individuals as alpha males, and do they prefer them? So what is the relationship between sex, dominance and prestige, and stereotypes and preferences? And in our second question, do we get a value add from breaking down dominance into two potentially distinct parts, its coercive aspects and its commanding aspects? Let's return to stereotypes first. So what we find is that leaders continue to be stereotyped as male and to some extent dominant. So in our studies, when participants were asked to imagine dominant leaders and prestigious leaders, as well as leaders in the military, sports, business, politics, and science at least, they imagined males. Similarly, when they were asked to imagine effective leaders across 6 different domains, those leaders were imagined as prestigious, but also as high on dominance. However, interestingly, among the very same participants that held these stereotypes did not reflect preferences. Rather, people seem to strongly prefer prestigious leaders, potentially because they like aspects that are related to prestige. These included more pro-social aspects like kindness and being good at getting the group to get along, and they seem to dislike coercive dominance in particular, suggesting the value add of dividing between commanding and coercive aspects of dominance. Moreover, in 3 out of our 4 studies, people actually slightly preferred female leaders. And one potential reason might be, as shown in our last study, is because they're potentially less associated with coercive dominance. So one of the implications of this is potentially for female leadership. So women are underrepresented in certain fields, such as politics and business. And this might happen for a variety of reasons. But it turns out that when women run in elections against men, they're actually tending to be equally likely to win. So this suggests researchers in this area to suggest that there is a pipeline problem, that women actually tend to run less often, that is, they select to be running less often, and they're recruited by parties with less frequency. So this phenomenon occurs for many reasons. But insofar as part of it might be that people are imagining that women are less electable or that alpha males are what voters are prefer, our data suggests the opposite. Rather, the same individuals that are holding these alpha male stereotypes are not necessarily preferring those. If anything, they have a slight preference toward femaleness, and especially for prestige. So maybe it's time to focus more on that less sex-typed pathway to status, prestige. And returning to our opening example of Newt Gingrich, when that very primatologist, Frans de Waal, was told about Gingrich's adoption of chimpanzee politics as his sense of the magnum opus of what politics meant, de Waal actually suggested that Gingrich should have looked at his other book, Peacemaking Among Primates. Because it turns out that even alpha male chimps don't display the alpha male caricature as thought of in the opener. In fact, some of the most popular long-lived alpha male chimps engage in cooperation, peacekeeping, and empathetic displays of pro-social behavior, as well as dominance displays. So that suggests that across species, leadership is often more nuanced than the alpha male stereotype, or perhaps rather, the alpha male caricature might lead us to believe. So I wanted to say thank you to my collaborators, Douglas T. Kenrick, Michael Barlev, and our honors student, Chris Martos, who collected our face data. And thank you for the C-WESS organizers for having us at this great workshop and also in having me give this talk. I'll be happy to take any questions and comments, and you're more than welcome to talk to me around the virtual campfire if you don't get a chance to, or please do feel free to email me. I'm always happy to chat. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Adi. We really appreciated that talk. That was super interesting. I can open it up now to questions. I think Alessandra Cassar had one, but I don't know if it's been answered or not. If you want to go ahead and expand on that, but if not, we're open. Okay, go ahead.
Very nice work. And I was wondering, relative to the first set of the results that you guys have, how during the protocol of the experiment, so how do you ask the question about imagining a leader? Because if you ask, imagine a leader in the, I don't know in English how to say it, but if you ask, imagine a leader among the existing one, of course they are gonna, let's say, imagine a president. Well, 45 of them are male, how could I possibly answer a female? Or imagine in the sense of not among the existing one, but among the realm of possibility. And one could have said a baboon, you know, anything.
Yeah, that's a great question. So for the first study, we left it extremely open-ended. So the prompts were, and we've done a couple of these studies where we sort of use this spontaneous cognition paradigm. I'm gonna see if I can't skip to that slide really quick so I can just grab it. Let's see, screen, see all slides. So this is the way that we tend to ask, oh, no, not that way. Let me just pan to it really quick. So this is the way that we ask these particular questions. It's imagine a leader who has a lot of power and has authority and control over people, and people don't get in this way. This is specifically when we're manipulating kind of the dominance and prestige description. In other cases, when we were doing the domain study, for example, it's just imagine a highly effective leader in business with no additional context. One of the things that we've collected that we have not yet analyzed is actually one of the questions we've started adding in this paradigm at the very end of our study is whether people imagined someone specific or whether they were imagining a stereotype or a prototype of an individual. I think when we've looked at those data, there isn't a lot of difference in how that affects the results, but I think it's worthwhile to go through and see if there are qualitative or even further in-depth quantitative differences between those two types, right? Because you might expect there to be some differences. Maybe people's prototypes are not the same as the specific individuals that they imagined. Thanks for the question.
Next up, we have Oliver Singh.
Hey, Adi, really cool stuff.
Thanks.
So one question that I had was that it seems like the preferences are often made in a bit of a social vacuum, in the sense that, you know, when I'm saying that I prefer a leader, prefer this leader or that leader, usually people are making a choice of a leader to lead me and my group, right? And so who are the other individuals in the groups that people are typically thinking about? I remember there was one of the studies where you asked them to think about them working as an employee or kind of like in an organization, right? But it seems like the individuals, you know, who exactly are the other individuals in the group, it doesn't seem clear who they are. And of course, I mean, another question is whether that's even meaningful to think about in the first place. Just curious about your thoughts here.
Yeah, thanks, Oliver. Also good seeing you. I think that's an interesting point. So I think that when we are dealing with the domain stuff, that might be a little bit clearer, right? Because you actually have like, so if it's like sports, you might have a sense of what that is. And we have some text boxes that we haven't analyzed where they have a more in-depth explanation of that. So it might be possible to get some of that from there. This actually relates to a follow-up that we're starting to do, which is playing around with who the group is. So is it kind of your in-group or your out-group, right? Because you can imagine, for example, coercive dominance in particular might mean something specific when it's targeted at the out-group versus the in-group. But I don't know that we have great questions for getting at that are not simply qualitative, right? So what we can look at is when people describe who the individual was, and let's say it's a sports captain. That can give us some sense of, okay, it's probably a sports team, so maybe it's other athletes, right? But it might be worth seeing if there's any systematic differentiation. We might actually even expect that there are levels of analysis differences here. So like a sports captain might look different than a sports manager, for instance, and that might have implications for both the kinds of tasks that that leader is engaging in and maybe what kinds of trait preferences we should think about with what people might want. So I think that's an interesting point that's worth digging into further.
And then next I have a question from Stacy Ruckus. She typed it up. I can just read it quickly. She said, great talk. Did you control for political orientation, since significant work indicates that conservatives score much higher on social dominance orientation, hierarchies, and authoritarianism? To that end, because SDO is higher for conservatives, they might be more likely to support coercive dominance in the presence of between group competition.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I've started looking at correlations, and what's kind of interesting is I don't know that I've looked at the coercive dominance, commanding dominance distinction with some of those political variables yet. What we do tend to see is I think that it's that liberals like more feminine leaders was one of the major correlations we saw in our data, but some of the political breakdowns is still kind of in our future directions. But I think it's a useful variable to add and consider.
Awesome. We've got a couple more questions. So next up is Carrie Getz.
Great talk. My question, it kind of relates to what Oliver was bringing up. It seems like for some of your tests for preferences, you're asking, you know, who do you want to work with versus who do you want to represent your group, right? And I see Christina kind of made a comment that's along those lines in the chat also, right? And I think especially for extending this to our, you know, political stuff and election process, you know, what are people thinking they're electing? You know, I'm never going to work directly with the vast majority of politicians. And so I might be valuing very different things for what I want there versus somebody who is going to have, I'm going to be working with very directly. And so I think that that distinction matters, and you kind of, how you measured it might, you know, throughout the different studies, either, you know, spoke to that directly or left it kind of open. So.
Yeah, I appreciate that clarification. I think that that sets Oliver's comment, I think, in some context too. So we can think about then the kind of like to work for variable as one kind of variable, electability as relating to different roles. And one of the other variables that we think about sometimes too is effectiveness, right? So your desire to work for someone might be different than how effective you think they are at different tasks. So it might be worth thinking about taxonomizing those different dependent variables and thinking where they have different implications for the extent to which people prefer, for instance, different aspects of dominance. That's a great suggestion. Thank you.
Next up is Joseph Manson.
Hi, great talk. I'm thinking about the work of Chris von Ruden on leadership in small-scale societies, which indicates that so people prefer more physically formidable men as leaders because those are the men who can police free riding within the group. And so it seems like a future direction would be to add some items. I guess you'd consider them as part of a general dominance factor, but that would be specifically tailored to that. Can this person make sure everyone pulls their weight? And I could see it could differ depending on the domain. So, and even it would be in very narrow domains. So one of your categories was a leader in the arts. Well, if someone's going to be directing an opera, then they ought to be able to make sure that everyone's pulling their weight. But if someone's like the director of an art museum, you know, not so much.
Yeah, I really like that idea because, right, these different traits should have kind of different affordances, which mean different things for both different domains and different tasks that you engage in domains. And actually, one of the fun things I'm actually doing for my comps is starting to explore what effective leadership means in these different areas and how do those start to break down. And one of the similarities we're seeing that's kind of interesting in each of these domains is that there are some folks that are kind of tasked with the idea part of the role, or like the more hands-on part versus like the more management type thing, right? So you made this distinction between, you know, in the arts, you have like kind of the manager of the opera house, right? You could think about that as being a certain kind of skill. So I think it's interesting to both think about the breakdown of the tasks and the domains, but also thinking about what are these things cueing? So one of the questions that we have included is, for example, physical strength. So it might be worth looking at some of those and the correlates with the different aspects of dominance.
And then next up for question, we have John Patton.
Hi, I had just a couple of thoughts. One, what do you, and this is kind of a suggestion for maybe future work. One would be as I was listening to talk, which was a great talk, if you set up scenarios where you had different leaders described that represented dominance, prestige, and other things, instead of just saying they're all effective, you couch it as, and they're that each team that you're putting together are competing against each other. And you can also do that in different domains, because I can imagine that I don't like to be bullied, but I might put up with a little bullying if it's warfare and the group, and maybe I want to bully and I'm willing to pay a cost for that because that means we're going to beat the other people. So I might not, maybe the preference for prestige would be different if it was, rather than saying everyone is effective, of you saying, yeah, but we're going to compete against each other and the winners are going to win some benefit that the others may not. Anyway, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting paradigm, and actually relates to some work that I think Aaron and Lassie had done looking at kind of preferences for dominance, particularly in these like kind of warfare situations and like the kinds of individual differences that lead people to want that. I think what's really interesting about the method that you suggested, John, is one thing you could do in a game like that is you can actually vary what the resource is that people win. So that might actually have some interesting implications for people's preferences and traits.
Yeah, actually, I was thinking you could do it in, you're all running for a political office, or you're competing in a business in which, for a contract, and only one is going to win it. Or, you could play with things that way as well and change but anyway.
That's a cool paradigm. No, I really like that. Thank you for suggesting it.
One more, looks like Gauri Gupta, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, in the chat they said across the different categories, one thing that may be common might be being led under pressure. Under such situation, would a dominant individual be perceived as more likely to be more decisive and hence be a better choice?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And it also is an interesting question, which aspect of dominance, right? So is it that commanding dominance might be the better choice in each case, and people still, even though like coercive dominance might be linked with decisiveness, people still don't like that. But I think that there is an interesting distinction. So one of the things I would have actually expected, sort of looking at these on a more domain by domain level, is I would have expected an even higher preference for dominance in, for example, sports and the military, where you're kind of dealing with the kinds of contexts in which maybe you're like negotiating with like coalitions in a sense, in terms of outgroups, but also that is especially rapid decision making. So like in a kind of warfare environment and in a sports environment, for example, coaches and generals might be tasked with especially a need for that more decisive behavior. So I think that that's an interesting variable to play with in the different domains. But when you're seeing that kind of rating of effective leaders, you're not necessarily seeing military and sports as significantly higher, which I thought was kind of surprising.